students are not reading by their children are not reading by the age of 9, there's all kinds of statistical evidence that those students are going to continue to struggle in school and in life. There's a variety of different data points that they've used, including incarceration rates. So it's really scary what happens to our children who are not reading by age 9. So the legislature, in an effort to address this and to do something meaningful with that research, passed the law saying that you cannot be promoted out of 3rd grade if you are not reading proficiently at the 3rd grade level. That was the starting point. And then what happened is, as special circumstances came to light, they allowed some good cause exemptions. So we're going to talk a little bit about what good cause exemptions are. Those have evolved over time, so there have been little tweaks along the way, and I'll give you the latest version of good cause exemptions. No big changes from last year, if you're familiar with them already. And as I mentioned, Florida was one of the first states to do this. Other states have followed suit, and there are a number of other states, I want to say in the vicinity of 19 or 20 at least, who also have enacted statutes regarding promotion 3rd grade to 4th grade. So that's what led us to have a portfolio in the first place, because a portfolio was one of the good cause exemptions identified by the state and approved by the state. So let's talk about what led us in OCPS to go with the embedded portfolio. We are now entering, this will be our 3rd year with the embedded portfolio, so we just wrapped up our 2nd year with that. So what happened 3 years ago that led to this change? It's important for you to know this as well, so that you understand some of the decisions that were made by the school board and why some of the things are the way they are. So what happened 3 years ago? Let's go back to the way things used to be. Before we had the embedded portfolio, typically the way schools would handle the portfolios is that around January or February, teachers and principals would start looking at their 3rd graders and identifying those students who were not meeting grade level expectations for reading. And those were students that the school was concerned might not pass the FSA in reading and therefore might be retained. So the school would then typically pull those kids out of class probably about twice a week and give them portfolio assessments, which at that time were lengthier. And so if you think about that, you're taking those kids who are not reading on grade level, starting January, February, you're pulling them from class about twice a week for 20 to 40 minutes at a time to work on these assessments, which are possibly giving them an avenue for promotion, but they're not teaching tools, so they're missing instruction to do this. So what happened that year, 3 years ago, is there was a group of parents who were opposed to standardized testing. They were opposed to high stakes testing. And they had encouraged their children not to participate in FSA. Many, if not most, of those children involved in this situation were reading at or above grade level. So these were not kids that the schools had identified and been pulling out to work on portfolios, because the schools had not been concerned that these children were not going to pass the FSA. When the FSA came around, the kids broke the seal and they didn't answer any questions. So, as a 3rd grade teacher, you're not supposed to be leaning over a child's shoulder to see what they're actually doing on the test, whether they're the schools had no way to know that these children had not taken the FSA, had not answered any questions until they got the results back a week before school was out, showing that these children in this particular group didn't have a score for FSA and therefore did not meet the legal requirements to be promoted to 4th grade. So here you had a pretty unique situation. You had a number of students who were being at or above grade level who could not legally be put to 4th grade because we didn't have an FSA score of 2 or higher. At that time, the schools kind of scrambled and offered the parents several opportunities. So at that point, the kids would have already taken, I think SAT 10 is what we had going at that time, or math, or both, I'm not sure. Just memory, I'm not sure. So the same parents who didn't want their children participating in FSA didn't want their children participating in math or SAT 10, because that was another form of a standardized assessment or a high stakes test. So they didn't have a score for that either. So they couldn't earn a good cause exemption through a score there. So then the schools offered to pull those students and provide the portfolio assessment so that these students are being promoted to fourth grade without having to go to summer school. Most of these parents turned down that opportunity as well because they did not agree with portfolio assessments. To them, it was an artificial way to measure whether or not a child was reading at grade level. What these parents did want is something they called authentic. So they wanted teachers to gather work that had been completed throughout the year. Now, granted, this is in late May, early June, so they wanted work completed throughout the school year that just wrapped up, that demonstrated proficiency on the 22 standards FSA measures, because that's what the state says a portfolio must do. So obviously, in most cases, the teacher had not retained copies of work that met the specific requirements of the state for portfolio, for inclusion in a portfolio. So this group of parents have a hard time understanding that, but when we talk in a few slides about what the state requires a portfolio assessment to consist of and what the work must look like, you'll understand why that was a difficult situation. So to make a long story short, it was a very difficult summer for those parents, for those students, for those teachers, because many third grade teachers were pulled in over that summer to be part of that conversation about what evidence do we have from the school year. And the school board, they tasked me with creating an embedded portfolio, because one of the things, if you were following the news that year and you saw there was even a court case about this, one of the things those parents were saying was, well, other school districts promote students based on grades alone. In every single case, those school districts had embedded portfolios. So while the parents saying that the school district promotes on grades alone, those grades were based on an embedded portfolio. So that all plays into the decisions that were made regarding the OCPS embedded portfolio. All right, that's the history lesson. Let's move on with what the portfolio looks like. This year, it has improved, I think, every year, and every year, teachers and parents and even students are a little bit happier with it. All right, so let's take a look at the good cause exemptions. There are 6 good cause exemptions. It's interesting that they're numbered through 7, but that's the state took out number 6, so they actually combined A6 with A7 and made it 1, but they didn't renumber them. So there are 6 good cause exemptions, but they're numbered A1 through A7, and there is no A6 anymore. We're going to mostly talk about A3 and A4. A3 is the approved alternative assessments. A4 is the portfolio. So that's what we're going to talk about during our time together today. So let's start with the approved assessments. The state lists a number of approved alternative assessments, and they expanded this widely since this all happened 3 years ago, because the state was involved, obviously, with this. It wasn't just our district. There were lots of districts involved in this situation 3 years ago. So at that time, it's 1 or 2, but now the state recognizes Iowa, SAT-10, MAP, Star Enterprise, Terra Nova, all of those, in addition to iReady. The only approved alternative assessment that we administer in OCPS is the iReady diagnostic. So you may wonder, well, why do we even need to know those other alternative assessments? Because you may get students from outside our school district or from outside the state in the spring, and you'll need to know that if they have these tests on their school records and they've met or exceeded the 50th percentile, then they could very well qualify for a good cause exemption, because that's always a tough situation when you have a kid who comes from out of the district or out of the state after FSA, and they are still subject to the statute about third grade retention. So this is a way to offer a few more options there. So the key here, and I put the word in red because this often gets overlooked, is that the student must achieve the qualifying score after the FSA has been administered. So for iReady, for example, the score that's at the 50th percentile is 535. If a student scores that 535 at the beginning of the year, and this is their first year in third grade, they do not yet have a good cause exemption. Score it again or higher than that at middle of the year, they still do not have a good cause exemption. It isn't until after the FSA has been administered and that end of year window for iReady, that's where they have to score that 535 or higher. Now, you can look at the beginning of the year and middle of the year scores, and it'll give you a good idea of whether or not the kid is likely to score that in that pertinent window, but you can't reassure the parent that they are safe into promotion, because we can't use those scores for good cause exemption if they're earned prior to the FSA. So one little caveat to that is if I'm a retained third grader. So let's say I'm sitting in third grade this August, September, and I just completed third grade. I scored a level 1, I'm retained. if I score 535 or higher at this beginning of the year I-Ready, then I would qualify for mid-year promotion. And we would want to promote those students as early as possible. So if they reach that score mid-September, you want to move forward, reach out to guidance, follow the process for mid-year promotion, because we don't want a kid who's going to be mid-year promoted to fourth grade sitting in third grade any longer than they have to, because they're going to need to understand fourth grade curriculum. So that's a real critical distinction. But that only works if I'm a retained third grader. Okay, so I'm going to move on from the approved alternative assessments, and let's talk about the portfolio. So as you can see from this slide, the state has very specific requirements for what the work in a third grade portfolio must look like. So although the language includes that it must be selected by the teacher, you can see if you look at this that they're specifying the number of words in the passage, the fact that there must be a passage, it must be a multiple choice question, and there must be a passage that is responding to. There are requirements for the difficulty level, the Lexile level of the passage, the percentage of literary versus narrative text. So there are a lot of very specific criteria. That's why I tried to explain to those parents 3 years ago, that's why the teacher who is teaching the standards, it's very possible that that teacher is not going to have 3 pieces of evidence for each of the 22 standards that meet this very narrow criteria, because we certainly would want our third grade teachers only using projects or work that fit this criteria. Otherwise, all they're doing is giving multiple choice questions, and clearly that's not the most meaningful instruction that they can get. So just wanted to share that with you. So let's talk about the embedded assignments for the portfolio. So we've made changes. What happens is at the end of each year, let me back up, during each year, about December, January, we ask for feedback. Now, once the portfolio embedded assignments, and I'm going to call them the required assignments, that's the required assignments and the embedded portfolio, those are the same thing. So typically the first year we've got feedback from teachers December, January. Well, right now that wouldn't make any sense because they haven't started getting the assignments until January. So we get our feedback informally. Well, I guess it's not informally, it's through a Google survey, we advertise it through the teacher newsletter that comes out each month, and we ask for feedback on how the required assignments are going. So we do that mid-spring, and then we have a much more formal session in the summer where we actually gather third grade teachers who sign up through Canvas. It's a form of summer PD. And we take a look at those items that were problematic and other questions that have come up, and we look at ways we can improve the required assignments in the portfolio process. So the changes that we have made are as a result of those ways that we seek feedback from teachers and parents and schools. So again, the assignments don't begin until January. That was a popular change. And the reason is if a student is struggling in reading in third grade and we start giving them portfolio embedded assignments, the required assignments in September of third grade, those children are who are going to need a portfolio probably not reading on grade level at the beginning of third grade. And so it's not setting them up for success. So now teachers have a full, all the way through till January, half of the school year, in order to help those students improve their reading skills so that they're more capable of responding to these required assignments successfully. So they begin in January, they end before the FSA results are received. The passages appear only once. That's another change that was made last year. We're keeping it this year. We found that when we use the same passage multiple times for different standards with different questions, kids remember that they'd seen the passage and they didn't reread it, even though the questions were different and they needed to. And we did throw out some more questions this year based on feedback from you. So those questions that did not discern between proficient and non-proficient readers have been thrown out and replaced. And that also applies to controversial questions. So if I receive a number of emails from schools about a specific question, then we look at that in the summer and either we rewrite it and we throw out the one that was so controversial. So that has happened again this year. So hopefully you'll see those questions. If you were part of the portfolio last year, you'll see those questions that you really didn't like are gone. So the assignments do meet all the requirements for the state rule for the portfolio. The slide that I showed you that had all those very specific requirements, all the assignments do meet those. All third graders must complete all 11 required assignments. It is part of our regular classwork. So for a complete portfolio, a child needs 3 pieces of evidence for each of the 22 standards that are assessed on the FSA. So that would be 66, 3 times 22 would be 66 pieces of evidence. The required assignments have a little bit of padding. We have 75 questions, and most of that padding is in the language standards because they're the most difficult to find pieces of evidence for, just based on your regular classwork that you do. One of the questions I often get about the required assignments and portfolio pieces in general is there's language in the street about 70% mastery. So think of it this way: each individual question is a piece of evidence. So the student either gets that question right or wrong. So it's either 0 or 100%. So we are exceeding that 70% when we're counting a single question answer as a piece of evidence. And of course, questions in the assignments align to standards that have already been taught by the time the assignments begin. All right. So speaking of that, let me mention, we have dates that we have, and it says on the document, suggested dates for the written assignments. That is exactly what they are. They're suggested dates. We at the district are not mandating when you get these. We're trying to space them out and make sense of them for you so that it's a logical sequence in terms of the timing. But that is a school-based decision as to when you give them. Other than don't start before January. They won't even be available until I make them available in December so that you have time to print or do other things you might need to do in preparation. But you wouldn't want to begin before January simply because this information with parents and we want to give students the best chances for success. Okay, I've got a question, so I'm going to pause for a moment. Mid-year promotion score, and I ready? Okay, it's always been 535, Julie. Great question. I get that question a lot. The number at the 50th percentile is identified by the state based on iReady norms, and so based on end of 3rd grade norms. So that has not changed. If it does change, that change will come from the state. Now I will let you know. That will be an urgent message. I don't anticipate it changing. So the score is 535 for the 50th percentile, regardless of where the child is. If it's a retained 3rd grader taking beginning of year in September, they still need a 535. That score doesn't change. So that was a great question. Thank you. All right. So this is another important consideration. This is why I gave you kind of that history lesson on slide 1. The assignments count for classwork grade. That was a critical component for that parent group that initially had the greatest amount of input in these changes that we've made, is that it's artificial if it's a test, and they wanted it to be part of the regular work that we do. So the setting in which students complete the 3rd grade required assignment should be an independent classwork setting, not a test setting. So they can't help each other with it, but it should be a classwork setting. And the grades. So that was another piece. Any other piece of work for the most part is graded. These need to be graded as well. And again, that was based on input from parents, that initial group. So we want this to be a help to the student. We don't ever intend that grade to be a detriment. So here is our recommendation for grading, because we did find our first year, because required assignments are as brief as possible. We found that sometimes because they're so brief that a child who is reading at or above grade level didn't particularly score well on some specific assignments. And when that counted as a grade, sometimes it brought that child's grade down. We definitely don't ever want that to happen. So our recommendation is you take the portfolio. The required assignments are given in quarter 3 and quarter 4. Take all of the required assignments that are given in quarter 3, take the student's grade on those, average them, come up with one single grade, and count that one grade as 10% of the overall ELA grade. That way it will not have a tremendous impact one way or the other, and it won't be a detriment to the child's grade. So that is our recommendation for grading. I have a question. Let me finish this slide and I'll get that question. This is really, really important. The assignments themselves may not be shown to parents or given to parents, not the passages, not the questions, none of that. What you may share is a tracking sheet by standard that will tell the parent where exactly the child is struggling if the child is gathering the pieces of evidence based on the assignments. The reason you cannot share the assignment itself or the passages is because while this is classwork, if a child is promoted based on a portfolio, ultimately this classwork is taking the place of a secure test of FSA. If we share that information with a parent, even at a conference, and the parent takes a little snapshot of that with their phone and puts it on Facebook, that would impact the integrity of the portfolios for every third grader in our district. So that's why the assignments must remain secure, even though they are assignments. All right, let me get the question before I move on. If a student enrolls after the portfolio process has begun, are they required to complete the ones they have missed? No. That's a great question. No, just pick up where you are, because that's the embedded classwork. So you just pick up wherever you are and you keep going. In the spring, and by spring I mean March, I wouldn't even say February, I'd say March, April. That's when you'll want to look at those students that you are really concerned about, who are not getting the scores on iReady that are giving you kind of confidence that they're going to be okay in terms of either getting a score in iReady or passing FSA. Then you'll want to look at a select group of students, not all of your third graders, and look at if you possibly want to fill some holes there for where they are missing some questions or some pieces of evidence. There's a whole separate presentation about that. I would not worry about that until you get to March or April. The presentation is available on our Elementary Curriculum and Instruction Canvas course in the portfolios section, and it says, I think it's titled Next Steps. So if you're just curious and you want to know what that looks like, you can view that presentation. I'll leave it there and it'll be available, but you really don't need to worry about that for most of your students, and you really don't need to be concerned about that at this point in the year. Okay, question. All right, so another important point of distinction, the difference between the tracking sheet and the portfolio score sheet. So as you can see on this slide, top one that you see of the pictures, the top one is the tracking sheet, the bottom one is the portfolio score sheet. All students need a tracking sheet, that's the top one. Only a few of your students are going to need that portfolio score sheet, and you're not going to make that decision until, as I was saying, March or April. So please put that portfolio score sheet aside. The reason we use the tracking sheet for all students is it's very parent friendly. We do have some tools in the portfolio section of the Elementary Curriculum and Instruction Canvas course to make it easier for teachers to use, so that you can sort this by the assignment rather than the standard for the purpose of completing it. But when you're sharing it with parents, it must appear as it does here, sorted by standard. Because what the parent needs to know is, for a given standard, my child has had maybe 2 opportunities to gather evidence and they have not answered correctly on either one. So as a parent, I need to look at that standard on CPALMs with the assistance of the third grade teacher or staff at the school, so that I understand what my child is struggling with, since the teacher cannot share the assignment itself. So the tracking sheet serves as a record towards completion of the portfolio. Parents may ask for it at any time once we get started with the required assignments. So you want to keep that up to date. You can keep it up to date electronically and then only print it when a parent requests it. That's fine. You can use a hard copy, whichever is easier for you. The tracking sheet by standard is required for all third grade students. That's again is the top one. The portfolio score sheet is only needed for those who are going to be working at a portfolio beyond the required assignments, and you won't know that until March or April. Okay, so hopefully that distinction helps. All right, so what are the advantages of the embedded portfolio plan? Students can complete a portfolio by the end of the school year. They would not have to go to summer reading camp. This would be for a student who is having success with those required assignments. The intent of this is the second bullet. We really want to provide a safety net and alleviate concerns about the FSO, so that everybody doesn't have that anxiety about, well, if my child doesn't get a level 2 or higher on FSA, they're going to be retained. So there's lots of ways to provide that reassurance. One is showing the parent the progress their child's making towards a portfolio by looking at the tracking sheet by standard for the required assignments. The other is to look at the iReady scores the student has earned, even though they don't have good cause based on beginning of year and middle of the year scores. If the child is getting close to 535 on those scores, that should give the parent and the teacher some peace of mind as well. There is the possibility that you'll have kids who are reading at or above grade level who just don't perform well on FSA for whatever reason. So this is a safety net for those kids, or for maybe they missed the entire window somehow. Again, it's a safety net. It also really supports you, the classroom teacher. So if a parent comes to you this August and says, you know what, I'm going to opt out of FSA, first off, let your principal know, because there's a response to that. So you, as a teacher, instead of having to find 66 different pieces of evidence that are going to fit that narrow criteria detailed by the state, you can say, you know what, that's great. We are not that's great that you're opting out, but the district and this school and me as a teacher, we already have a plan. We have classwork assignments that actually fit criteria for a portfolio and align with the standards. So a portfolio will be created for your child. So you can share that rather than you having to create one. So how are we sharing this information? These BBB presentations this week, we have recordings of them that will be available shortly after this week. Everything that you'll need will appear in the third grade portfolio section of the elementary curriculum and instruction Canvas course. Anyone who's a staff member at an elementary school in OCPS is automatically enrolled in that elementary curriculum instruction Canvas course, so it should appear on your Canvas dashboard. You might have to accept the invitation to the course if you're new, but you should automatically be invited. There is a parent letter. There's a memo coming out. I believe it is today, Thursday. I believe it's coming out. It's either today or next week. I'm not sure which. To principals that has the letter that will be sent home by the school at the beginning of the year and again at the end of Q1 with the report cards that explains to parents about third grade promotion and also the required assignment. I do Parent Academy presentations, so that's another way that I reach parents. And then there is a recorded presentation available right now in the same place I keep talking about, that third grade portfolio section of the elementary curriculum and instruction Canvas course that you can use during back to school nights. You can use it with parent conferences, third grade parent evenings, whatever you want. It goes over the same information in a very parent friendly way. So it's recorded. You don't want to just send parents to, hey, go watch this on your own. You have school staff there to answer any follow-up questions, but if you do this presentation yourself, you can, but you don't have to. You have that support for you. All right, so important reminders as we get near the end of this presentation. Required assignments are not assessments. They're not appropriate as a way to measure whether or not the child was successful on that unit or that standard, in terms of that shouldn't be the only way you're measuring it. It's also not appropriate as a teaching tool. So taking that required assignment and going over the incorrect answers with your class is not a good use of your time as a teacher. There are so many more meaningful ways you can teach your students rather than using these, which again were created in our definition provided by the state. So those are important reminders. The required assignments may not be sent home with students, may not be given to parents, may not even be shown to parents. Remember, you can use the tracking sheet instead. The tracking sheet must go with the student if the student transfers to another school. That's most meaningful within OCPS. I would still send it if they're outside OCPS, but it may not make as much sense to someone in a different school district because every school district has their own way of meeting this requirement. And required assignments provide minimum evidence needed for a portfolio. So there are some students who might need additional opportunities in the spring, and that's what I was mentioning about March or April. We'll have another BBB session about that, and there already is a recorded presentation if you want a sneak preview available to you. So where is all this stuff? I keep telling you, it's in the portfolio section. This is a screenshot of the elementary curriculum and instruction Canvas course, the icons you'll see on that main landing page. And so I've circled the icon for third grade portfolio. It exists all by itself. I didn't put it under ELA and social studies. I wanted it to stand out, so it's an icon by itself. So as you can see on the slide, there's lots of things that are available within that section of the Canvas course. All right, if you have questions about the third grade portfolio, Michelle Platzer is our senior administrator for elementary ELA and social studies. She can help you. I can help you. And if you have questions about good cause exemptions, that goes to guidance, and Carla Owens is the contact there. I will throw out one more name that's not on the slide. If you have questions about the approved alternative assessments, and Amber, I'm going to get your question in a minute. Frank Gilbert, Dr. Frank Gilbert, and his test development and measurements, Barrington and Cindy, are the ones you would want to ask about that. You're welcome to CC me and or Michelle on your question, because there's a lot of overlap between what we do, what guidance does, and what TDM does. So you're welcome to loop us all in, but if it's specific to an approved alternative assessment question, I will definitely pull in Frank and his team to get you the answer that you need. All right, Amber's question is the STAR Enterprise test we have through Renaissance not same as the one that's approved? It is. You want to be sure. I don't think it's possible right now for you to have Renaissance and AR without having the Star Enterprise version. In other words, the Star version that was not Enterprise, I don't think is available anymore. Marcy, not only is the PowerPoint available, a recorded version of this will be available, even better, next week. I don't have the link up, so I did 3 of these. They're going to choose the best one and post it. But yes, it will be available. So back to that, you're welcome. Back to that Star Enterprise question. Yeah, if you have Renaissance, you have Star Enterprise. If you want to be sure, print a student report once you give Star. It'll say Star Enterprise at the top of the report. That's how you can be sure. You want to be extra cautious, though, about Star Enterprise, because I didn't cover that in this presentation, but because this is really TDM's area, but I want you to be aware. The state makes some very specific stipulations of the number of times an approved alternative assessment can be given and the amount of time that must exist between administrations. So just like the iReady, if you give Star Enterprise at the beginning of the year and the child's at or above the 50th percentile, they do not have a good cause exemption. They have to do that after the FSA in reading has been administered. The only exception, okay, this is the interactive part. There's one exception to that. See if you can type in the chat box, who could get a good cause exemption at the beginning of the year with our iReady. I wish I had Jeopardy music to play. Can anybody type the answer to that? Yes, Amber, congratulations. That's a retained 3rd grader. Yes. Ooh, Amber. Yes, if you're a retained 3rd grader, then that is the exception to the rule. But all other 3rd graders, you have to score it after the FSA and reading has been given. So if you're a retained 3rd grader, it is after your FSA and reading. You took it last. Okay, that is the end of my presentation. Ooh, 3 minutes over. Any questions for me? You can either raise your hand or you can type in the chat box. Thank you. I really appreciate what you're all doing. I know it's a very busy week for you. I appreciate you tuning in. I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful school year, and we are here to help you here in curriculum instruction and digital learning. All right, I'm going to stay online to answer any questions in the chat box, but I'm going to stop broadcasting my picture. Oh, hang on, I've got a question. Student is new to our school, was retained and doesn't pass the 535 and does not have a portfolio. Restart the portfolio, Craig. You won't start the required assignment until January. Linda, why don't you call me offline, because that's a kind of a unique situation. My extension is 2002788, and I can talk to you a little bit more about that unique situation. I'm gonna stop the recording, stop my camera, but I'm still here I'll be able to answer in the chat box if you have any follow-up questions. If you don't, thank you again for joining me. Thank you for all that you do, and have a great rest of the week and a great start to the school year.